Hi friends, my name is Emily. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be recommending some books that I read a really long time ago. I read pre-booktube, or I feel like I haven't talked about enough and are just phenomenal. Here's a really sad thing. So last month for Black History Month, I went through my read bookshelves here and I pulled books by Black authors that I had read pre-booktube, and they happened to all be by women. I will leave that down below because those are still all phenomenal recommendations and I think you should read those too. But the really sad thing was when I was looking for books by women that I had read pre-booktube, I realized that a lot of the books were written by men. Like, I actually had a really hard time finding books that I read pre-booktube, so while I was in school, while I was in university, which says a lot about the design of English lit courses. Now that I think back to it, there was always like one token woman in each course, but the majority of the texts that we were reading were written by men. Hence the purpose of this whole month, highlighting fantastic books by women. I have 3 books here that I have just read the shit out of, and I have marked up to the point of if I want to reread them, I probably need to buy a new copy. Like, that's how much I have read and loved these texts, and so I want to share them with you. And the first one is Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. So this is a piece of feminist science fiction that I read during a women's studies course, actually, and then again during my master's. It's a book that deserves a lot more hype than it gets. So this is a fairly old book that is asking us to think about gender. It's asking us to think about the medicalization of women's bodies. It's asking us to think about mental health and the ways in which historically people diagnosed with mental health issues have had their agency taken away from them. This is a book about a Latinx woman, Connie, who is institutionalized for mental health issues. Throughout it, we are asked to question whether or not she is mentally ill or she is really traveling via her mind to a future in which society is a lot more equal in terms of gender and labor, and it's environmentally friendly. It's a lot more focused on equality. The text invites you to make sense of Connie's experiences as a side effect of her mental health. At the same time, these experiences are so rich and colorful, and you really want to believe that Connie is experiencing this time travel, mind-melding connection with a human in a utopic future. And so I think the book asks us to do a lot of thinking about a lot of really important topics. It's a good read. Like, on top of that, it's just a good, engaging read, and I enjoyed it both times that I read it. I think it would make a really great book club read. Like, if you want to have some really great discussions, I think reading a book like this, or specifically this book, would be a great choice. And I can't not recommend it in this video. The next book I have here, I do mention frequently, but that is because it is just so good and I love what it is doing, and that is Swing Low a Life by Miriam Toews. So this is a novel that, can we really call it a novel? It blends biography and fiction, and it does it in a really interesting way because this is based on Miriam Toews' own life experience. One morning, Mel Toews put on his coat and his hat and he left the house prepared to die, and he basically stood on the train tracks and ended his life. This was after a stint in the hospital in which he was having a lot of memory issues, and it was really confusing for him. So while the author, like the actual human, was visiting her father, she would always write notes for him in his voice. It would be like, "Today, Miriam visited me in the hospital." And so she wrote these notes to him to help him make sense of his day and to alleviate some of his confusion. So after he died by suicide, she continued to write in his voice as a way of grieving and as a way of trying to understand how he could possibly have gotten to that point. And it was a way for her to also make sense of a childhood living with a person who has just ups and downs. I believe Mel was diagnosed with bipolar, and so she is trying to make sense of her life and trying to make sense of her father's death through like fictionalized biography, if that makes sense. And I just think, again, it asks us to think about grief, it asks us to think about trauma, it asks us to think about narrative perspective, who has the right to tell what stories, what are we doing when we appropriate others' voices? Does this book do a good job? Does this book do something despite appropriating her father's voice and telling his story? It asks us to think critically about mental health institutions and how they frequently fail folks. And I think it's a really important read, but I also think it's really beautiful, and I think it's incredibly well written, and it pushes boundaries between genres. It defies clear categorization, and I love it. I honestly think there's more of my writing in this text at this point than there is Miriam Toews. Like, I genuinely have just read the shit out of this book and made so many notes. I think I've read it 4 or 5 times for essays, actually. I think if I were to read it again, I would have to buy myself another copy because there's just too much of my brain in this book. If you haven't read it and those sort of discussions interest you, I think Toews is doing interesting work, and I would recommend that you check her out. So the last book I have here is Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson. So she is a First Nations woman whose father grew up in Haisla territory near Kitimat Village, BC. This is a piece of Canadian Indigenous literature, and it looks at the experience of being Indigenous in Canada. Canada did a lot of really shit things to the Indigenous populations that lived here. There's no way around that. Canada is a colonialist country. Settlers have done a really, really effective job of destroying communities and cultures that existed here first. Like, within my lifetime, residential schools were open, and residential schools worked to systematically destroy Indigenous cultures by pulling Indigenous youth away from their families, abusing children, experimenting on children. It's absolutely disgusting what Canada has done to the Indigenous populations. That's why Indigenous literature is so important to me. It's why I am always trying to read what comes out, and I think Monkey Beach is particularly interesting. The surface story, it's about Lisa Marie, whose family has experienced this personal tragedy when her brother is in a fishing boat accident and disappears. Like, his body is missing. In the present, her family is sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for news of their son Jimmy. But Lisa Marie is also flashing back into her past quite a bit, giving us insight into the community, the experience of growing up as an Indigenous person, connections to culture, disjointing from culture, all of that. This is my favorite work by Eden Robinson because I think it's the most accessible, but she has also just started writing and releasing the Trickster trilogy, which is, I think I've heard it described as, and I have latched onto this because I think it is perfectly adept at describing this literature, the dystopian now. A lot of like white science fiction writers write about dystopian futures, right? Like The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham is a dystopian future. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood is a dystopian future. But what a lot of Indigenous literature reflects is a dystopian now, because like the past, before colonialism, before settlers, everything functioned. And then settlers came in and fucked everything up. And now these communities are existing in the dystopian now. Reframing these texts in that way has radically shifted my engagement with these texts. And so the Trickster trilogy, sorry to go back to that, very much reflects the dystopian now. It looks at the intergenerational trauma of residential schools and how adults being completely divorced from their culture, from their families, and physically, emotionally, mentally abused by the system, how that abuse affects the way that they live and the way that they parent, and how that parenting is often abusive and sort of repeats the cycle. Her works are beautifully written. I think the Trickster trilogy is really oddly paced, which is why I'm not recommending that. Like, I love what the trilogy is doing, but I don't think it's a great access point, which is why I'm recommending Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson. I do want you to read the Trickster trilogy. I think everybody needs to read the Trickster trilogy because I think it's doing really interesting things to what we might think of as fantasy literature. I don't think it's as accessible as Monkey Beach, and Monkey Beach exposes you to Robinson's writing, which is gorgeous and touches on similar themes without being like totally overwhelming. If you are interested, like once you read Monkey Beach, if you fall in love with Robinson's writing, go on to the Trickster trilogy because it's phenomenal, but this is a phenomenal book in and of itself. It stands alone, and I can't not recommend Eden Robinson in a video where I talk about phenomenal texts by women. Those are 3 texts by women that I think you should read ASAP. I think all 3 of these texts and these authors are doing really interesting work. Out of like a lot of the books that I have read since starting BookTube, since leaving university, these stories really stand out as pushing boundaries. So before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this and longer form content possible. I really appreciate the work that you enable me to do. If you are interested in becoming a patron, links to the Patreon page will be in the description box down below. Once again, thank you, patrons. So that is it for today's video. Let me know your thoughts on these books in the comments down below. Have you read any of these books? Do you like any of these books? What was your experience reading these books? And if you have any books written by women that you think are really phenomenal, really groundbreaking, like really challenging to the genre that they are written in, challenging to a certain topic, books that push boundaries basically, leave those down below and let's create a really excellent reading list for all of us. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye.